When children use the excuse, "But everyone else is doing it," parents seldom find this as an acceptable defence for their offspring. However, psychological studies demonstrate that these same parents, and everyone else, tend to take their cues for proper behaviour in most social contexts from the action of others. This pressure is called conformity bias. Psychologist Solomon Asch created an experiment that became known as the Asch experiment and is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he is the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity. In the experiment, Asch explains to the students that they are taking part in a test that involves the perception of line length. He goes on to explain that their task will be simply look at the line on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. The actors have been told to match the wrong lines, and the volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
One.
2.
1.
Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3.
3.
3.
The Asch experiment has been repeated many times and the results have been supported again and again. We will conform to group because we are social creatures. We are very much aware of what people around us think, and we want to be liked. So you see, group dynamics is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. This bias to conform is much greater, of course, when others are not strangers, but maybe family or friends. The impairment of individual decision-making, known as groupthink, where people decide in groups, often make more extreme decisions than any individual member initially. Moral reasoning applies logic and moral theories, such as ontology or altruism, to specific situations or dilemmas. However, people are not especially different because they often reach strong moral conclusions they cannot logically defend. In fact, evidence shows that the moral principle or theory a person chooses to apply is often, ironically, based on their emotions and not on logic. Their choice is usually influenced by internal biases or outside pressures, such as self-serving bias or the desire to conform. So, while we like to believe we approach ethical dilemmas logically and rationally, the truth is often the reverse. So, what about danger? How do we behave when we are making moral or logical decisions that could impact our personal safety? It's obvious that we don't intervene in many kinds of emergency situations because there's too great a risk to life or limb. But now, what happens when you're in a situation where if you don't act, there could be risk to life? Imagine this: you're in a room and a smoke alarm goes off. Smoke is pouring out from under the door, and if you don't leave that room quickly, a fire could erupt and you could be suffocated, or worse still, burnt to death. It's obvious what you do. But now, what happens if you're in that same room and there are 10 other people and all of them do nothing? Do you take action when other people define the situation as do nothing rather than do something? Because your life is at stake by following the herd. Acting differently from your group can make you an outcast, but what would you do if you knew your group were entirely wrong? Would you, for example, sit in a burning room just because everybody else does? This hotel conference suite has been prepared for a focus group discussion on internet shopping, but all is not as it seems. The room is rigged with 4 hidden cameras and 6 concealed microphones. The first participant is Mary Mitsuno, a London student who thinks she's arrived early. What she doesn't know is that behind this door there's about to be a serious fire in the hotel kitchen, or at least the illusion of one created by a smoke machine and some sound effects. What will she do now she's noticed the smoke and is concerned at this point? She decides to investigate to find out what's going on. She's immediately taken responsibility for figuring out what to do. Mary does the sensible thing and evacuates quickly. She even leaves her bag and coat.
As I've never been in a fire situation before, I tried to remember the kind of things that you're supposed to do, so I left my stuff and just went out.
But Mary was on her own. This time, 7 actors were planted, all who were in on the experiment. They were told that when you see smoke, do nothing. The second participant is Lauren Hefferman, also a student. What will she do in this situation? Well, she will, like us all, be following a script. The script is partly written in her mind. It's a script which is borrowed from things like sitting exams. Most situations like this have some element or expected or scripted behaviour. But what will happen to her script when a slightly unusual situation becomes very unusual? Nothing to start with, so her attention is grabbed. Now, how long before she dashes out of the room? She's checking increasingly to see what other people are thinking, but who can she appeal to? The answer is nobody, so she turns to the norm of a group and ignores the smoke. In a real fire, the people in this group would be in very serious danger by now. She's waiting for someone else to react. Why isn't anyone else reacting? She feels uncomfortable and she doesn't want to embarrass herself by taking the lead or by taking action. But something is definitely wrong. Lauren stayed in the room for 20 minutes after spotting the smoke, concerned but immobile. The fire brigade says that if the fire had been real, even if the flames hadn't burnt through the door, she would have died of asphyxiation in this time. In the end, she was asked to leave. This experiment was carried out 10 times, and the same thing happened over and over again. If the person was on their own, they left quickly. If they were in a group of 3 or more, they stayed rooted to the spot, and the average length of time they stayed is 13 minutes. In 1979, a blaze at Woolworths in Manchester killed 10 people. The fire occurred during the day when the shop was occupied by hundreds of people. Most of the people managed to get out quite safely, and the people that died in the fire were actually using the restaurant at the time. But why so many fatalities in the restaurant? Investigators eventually realised that people simply hadn't evacuated. They waited to pay their bills. That was their routine. You see, we go into a restaurant, we sit down, the waiter comes over, we choose a meal, we eat the meal, we pay for the meal, and then we leave the building. And while everyone was still following the same script, nobody wanted to be the first one to stray. One of the main reasons why people died in the Woolworths fire is because they didn't want to be the first to react, and they didn't want to stand out from the crowd, and went along with the crowd behaviour. Only one person in the experiment didn't go along with crowd behaviour: artist James McKinchey. James isn't going to sit in a dangerous room just because everyone else does. Or is he? The power of the group proves irresistible. The reassurances of the rest of the group that somebody else is responsible seems to be sufficient to pull him back into place. Instead of leaving the room and calling for help, he sits back down again. Now everybody's looking at the smoke, but in some ways that gives the group decision more influence. After all, if everybody can see the smoke and no one's panicking, well, it would be crazy for him to do so. James stays in the room for another 10 minutes before finally leaving. In a real fire, he wouldn't have been able to. He'd have been unconscious and close to suffocation. We are living in unprecedented times. Both moral and critical thinking is now more important than ever. Doublespeak, misinformation and fear porn are pumped through scrying mirrors that we all so readily and willingly adopted as part of our everyday life. It has long been known that we humans are susceptible to groupthink and conformity bias. It is with this knowledge that the media and powers that should not be use their spellcraft to manipulate and terrify the masses. In a time where we're all being asked to make life and death decisions, there is a narrative being pushed where people going against groupthink are being demonised for thinking critically and going against the herd. In such times, it would be wise to be aware of how easily we can all be influenced and pressured into group conformity. It is wiser still to remember that we are sovereign men and women, and that our decisions should be made with this knowledge in our hearts.